Thank you, John. My session, I was asked to talk about governments and can we trust them to keep our personal data secure. As John has said, I'm part of the Bang networking group. I'm also an independent consultant. And in this session today, in the brief 15 minutes we've got, I'll touch lightly on some of the topics. There's a longer paper that will be coming out that I'll put out on Twitter at when it's completed. So these are some of the highlights from that paper. Going to talk about trust, and in trust we can define it different ways, but it's essentially the firm belief in reliability, truth, or ability of someone. And so we all try and establish that trust with other people as we're working, and that extends to government bodies as well. When I'm standing up here talking, you want to know, can you actually trust me in what I'm saying? And we do that, we give different cues and things when we do that, and I tend to put the slide with previous clients on the back, so that if you see a company that you trust on there, you will assume if they trust me, there is that link. So that's one of the ways we do this. But it falls apart if you don't trust those people and don't trust those companies. And when we're talking about government bodies, we're really talking about will they hold that personal data accurately, securely, and not treat us unfairly. And it's a very wide body of groups, especially in the UK, schools, police, ambulance, medical, local government, House of Parliament, the whole area. So huge amount. But I'm going to touch on a couple of other countries and what they're doing. And compare it, because it is relevant when we come to look back at GDPR. So India has the world's largest biometric ID system in place. It's voluntary, but 1.2 billion people have registered. And when I say it's voluntary in commas, in quotes like that, if you're not registered, you have enormous difficulty now getting access, and there has been at least one death where people haven't had access to medical attention because they weren't registered. So it's ID-based, it's residency, not citizenship, it's highly insecure. You can access the entire database, a copy of the entire database for $10. Anyone can do that. You can buy software to print out fake ID cards for $5 further. You've got to pay your $10 to access the data first, and then you can, an extra $5 will let you print out cards. So although government bodies within India have published sensitive data online when they shouldn't have done, that kind of pales into insignificance compared to the low cost of entry for actually getting your own copy. And some companies have misused the data. That number lets you set up bank accounts. Airtel set up bank accounts for their customers without them knowing. The government was paying subsidies for fuel into some of those bank accounts. It was going to Airtel. There's all sorts of abuses by business of that system. So it's been used way beyond the original government intention. China also have a system, and theirs is a social citizen scoring system, so coming at it from a very different point of view. It's voluntary at the moment, but it will be compulsory by 2012, so these voluntary systems are not that voluntary really. They don't have Western-style credit scoring at the moment, so the idea was to give a picture of how trustworthy you are, and that's a picture of what you might see on your mobile phone app when you're registered with this. And you can see the bar at the bottom, the different colours. You start off with a score that puts you about the high end of the orange, and then you have to do things that will improve your score and avoid actions that will reduce your score. And you can see the different, I don't know how good the screen is, but it's 5 categories there: characteristics, performance, behaviour, connections and history. And it's not clear what criteria is behind all of these. It's not published. So it's few facts on it. There's a huge amount of information more on it. But your social score gets influenced by things. If you're positive about the government on social media, your score goes up. So it's a form of control. They're basically implementing control by positive and negative reinforcement. If your friend's scores influence your score, so if you've got a friend that's persistently very negative about the government on social media, that will pull down your score, not just theirs. What you buy, because it's linked to the Alipay system, will affect your scores. So if you buy games, that's regarded as negative behaviour. If you're buying a load of computer games, your score goes down. If you buy nappies, your score goes up because you're regarded as a family-oriented person, and that's behaviour they want to reward. So it's the most, but that's only some of the factors that have come out unofficially. There isn't an officially published set of criteria. But that score determines access to both government and corporate services. So where you can send your children to school will depend on your score. Higher score, you get better access to schooling. A higher score gives you a higher ranking on dating sites. It will affect every part of their lives. I don't know about anyone else. I find that frankly terrifying, but they seem to, at the moment, people are enrolling in it fairly willingly. Now, our personal data is held within the UK. It's held in lots of disparate systems. There is no system that pulls this together yet. I think that's probably a good thing, given what's happened in other countries. I'd certainly want a lot more control before there was. But at the moment, there are areas that concern us as to whether they're keeping that data secure, whether they're using it to treat us fairly, and whether they're keeping it accurate. So we have to register and be authenticated by private company. We've got a choice, but the post office or some others, if we want to access government services. Anyone who does their own tax return, I didn't realise you needed it for tax return because I don't do tax. I really find it quite scary and let my accountant do all of it. So I've had to register recently for another reason. We hope there's sufficient safeguards in place. We hope that all went in the contracts. We're really not too sure. But government bodies hold data on almost all aspects of our life, including stuff we wouldn't expect. We know medical data is held. That makes sense. We know information on where we live is held for our council tax. But there's 25,000 people who may not realise their names are on cautionary contact lists for councils. And these people, there are, in theory, people who could pose a risk to staff, but it includes, and this is by the council's own reporting, a 3-year-old that's been labelled aggressive. That 3-year-old won't know they're on that data's been held on them or able to prove the accuracy or otherwise. A 101-year-old was on the list for financial issues. 50-year-old, the note is that he pulls faces when he's been drinking. It might not be very pleasant, but you wonder why it needs to be on that, why government bodies need to hold that type of information. Now, before we go back into looking at data breaches, there's other security threats to data, and I assume in the morning you heard from the NCSC. They've warned that a Category 1 cyber attack on the UK is a matter of when, not if. And Russia poses particular concerns. The point I'm coming back to is that's very concerning, and I hope you heard a great deal more about it this morning, but that actually errors by people are still the biggest threat to our personal data held by government bodies, more than anything else. There's the WannaCry ransomware attack. It was any systems that were not up to date on their patching were vulnerable. The government systems, they don't tend to pay that well for any sort of technology expertise, so cybersecurity is no different. If you ever look at the job ads, what they ask for and what they're willing to pay is a huge mismatch in most cases. So they will tend to get people who are less experienced. And they have a great deal of very old systems out there right across every government body, but particularly where the NHS is got a great deal of other things to spend money on. It was actually stopped by Marcus Hutchins, but he was subsequently arrested in the US, not related for hacking charges, but not related to this one. So there's no suggestion he had anything to do with this particular ransomware. But it does raise questions about protecting some of these cyber experts. There's a very fine and not at all clear line between doing the research necessary for them to gain that expertise and hacking. You will go over that line at times without necessarily even knowing that. And we do need to think about how we're actually going to protect those experts. It will make others think twice before raising their heads above the parapet. And I could talk for an hour on the way Cambridge Analytica has used data in recent elections and the legal challenges and whether they were allowed to collect and use the data they had. But we don't have time, so it's just to throw that one out there. That is a concern. But more mundanely, it's a lot of it is poor understanding of data protection. There's a Freedom of Information Act that's been in the press very recently where Public Health England disclosed 4 years' worth of patients' lung cancer data. And the data went to researchers for American tobacco companies. They could easily have avoided having to respond to that Freedom of Information Act. There's various let-out clauses, and there would have been one that would have stopped that if they wanted to. So they're just letting out information. Oxford Council proposed to record all conversations in taxis. They're not allowed to do that and hold that data. They didn't appear to realise. So local authorities record an average of 4 data breaches a day. I'm going to have to go over some of this very quickly now, but MPs have a number of data breaches. There's a poor understanding. Came out as they were trying to protect, Conservative MPs were protecting Damien Green, that there's widespread sharing of passwords. That's just a basic. You kind of, I know what types of mistakes people make, but even I was shocked by that. And Nadine Dorris is particularly bad. The ICU has tried to compel her to respond to a subject access request, and she's just ignoring them, and they have no sanctions against her. With GDPR, it does protect EU citizens. It's not clear what will happen after Brexit, but there will be a significant impact. There's measures for countries outside of the EU to have their data protection regime assessed and be brought in that way. But the ICO is going to be a concern at that point because it's under-resourced and overwhelmed with reports. It's fined some government bodies, but there's very few reports resulting in action. As we've seen with Nadine Dorries, she's just ignores what they have to say, and there is no financial impact to her as a result of that. So just flouting the law there. And I think part of the reluctance to fine government bodies is those fines ultimately fine taxpayers. So you can understand the reluctance, but it does create a problem. I've put on this slide just a snapshot from their own website of the actions they've taken July to September of last year. So we can see on that their major ones. They did fine one London borough, so one government body, and Talk. The fine was tiny compared to what they'd done, but at least they'd got something. And they've done 2 undertakings, so that's where they've done reports with actions that they should undertake to 2 government bodies, and they're following up with a 3rd, Kent Police, on theirs. So 4 government bodies on that. That's in a quarter. I mentioned before, one of the statistics, 4 data breaches reported by local authorities, so not every type of government body, a day. These are 4 that they've followed up in a quarter. There is a massive, massive mismatch in terms of what the ICO can do and what's actually happening just in local government. John will be pleased. I'm about to go on to my last slide there, really. The conclusion, sadly, looking at this, is at the moment, the governments, and I do that globally, cannot be trusted to keep our personal data secure and use it fairly. I mean, the India and China schemes, they're different, but they're positively Orwellian. It's and GDPR does provide protection for EU citizens. The use of our data outside of EU jurisdiction is a grey area in many ways, and certainly the Cambridge Analytica use of data that I mentioned falls into that. We need to continue to hold these bodies to account. Ignorance and people error, it's still a bigger threat up to now, but we know there are risks to those attack on the infrastructure. That attack, when it happens, because there will be one, it may not affect our personal data at all, so it may not be a GDPR issue for government bodies. It may be a different attack. It may bring down physical infrastructure like powers. We've had attacks in the Ukraine. It might affect financial services, but it won't necessarily be a GDPR impact on that. And that's the end of mine. That's the reference that when it came back to trust, that's part of what we do. So